Thank you all so much for coming in person. I'm really excited to talk about language and AI and just have a lot of fun today. So it's been about 75 years since Alan Turing first published a paper that would change how we think about artificial intelligence. Actually, next year, I think, will be the 75th anniversary. He proposed this task that has now become legendary, the imitation game. For those of you who have not heard of this or seen the famous movie, it's a very simple test. So the goal is for a computer to try and fool a person into thinking that they're actually a real human. There's an interrogator who is human and asks questions of two players, one who is a person and one whom is not. And they can only use the answers to the questions as evidence for the humanity of the person. Now, when Turing first devised this experiment, he was trying to answer a question that was simple but very difficult, which is, can machines think? And in the 50s, that might have been something really far out there. But now, in even the past year, I think it feels a lot more relevant. So let me ask a question of all of you by a show of hands. In the past year, who has used ChatGPT or DALL-E or some other language model? Okay, yeah, quite a few of you. So now, as a follow-up question, how many of you think that it passed the Turing test? Were you convinced that it was? Really? Yeah?
Well, I know it's not, but it
Wow, okay, that's high praise. Okay. Anybody else think it passed? Yeah? Nice. What, out of curiosity, what programs were you using? ChatGPT, same, yeah. So I'll say, like, I have also been using it for the past year. I've been really blown away by how amazing it is. I know someone who was really convinced that Alexa was an actual actor who was just kind of messing with people for a while. They couldn't believe that it was like a computer. But I will say, having used ChatGPT more extensively now, you do start to find limitations with what it can and cannot do. And a lot of the limitations come with like formal reasoning and less so the language aspect of it. So that's really interesting, right? Because on the one hand, it's super skilled at language processing, and maybe it even shares that with the way that we do language processing. But on the other hand, it still falls short in a lot of really key ways. So these are some questions to think about when we start to compare language in humans versus language in AI. Maybe the best way to do it is to think of it as like looking at a bird wing versus a fly wing. They're two structures that have a similar function, but they have a different mechanism. They have a different evolutionary path that led them to that state. And yet, if we look at the similarities and the differences between both, we might understand something intrinsic about flight itself. So similarly here, if we understand how language works with AI and how it works in a human, maybe we understand something about language itself. So why do we care about this? Honestly, that's enough justification for me just as an academic. But you know, there is the real world. And I think in the past year, we've really seen that AI can have a huge effect on how we see commerce and even just our very humanity. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what kind of a world do we want to build with AI? Is it going to be one where AI dominates the workforce and sort of makes human purpose obsolete? Or I think more usefully, is there going to be one where we have a collaborative relationship with AI? We work together to benefit or to use the benefits of both of our skill sets to solve problems that either one of us wouldn't be able to do on our own. But time will tell. And I think the way to get there is to have conversations like this one across disciplines and with people who are not necessarily experts, like me, not an expert at all. I'm really hoping this is sort of an informal discussion because my motive for starting this panel was I knew basically nothing about AI or how it affects language, and I wanted to learn more. And I hope by showing up, you guys are expressing the same. What do you think is the best definition of fluency, and what might be some metrics we can use to test it?
I had a grant built around exactly that question about 10 years ago, and actually it turns out that like words like intelligence and consciousness that sound huge and monumental and indescribable, when you dig down into it, it really comes down to the simple dictionary definition. Fluency means flowing. It means the ability to produce speech that flows continuously with intelligible ideas. I mean, really, the intelligibility and the educational sound are sort of secondary. The primary quality is that it flows.
in CSD, I would say fluency, we think of as the fluency of speech, not necessarily of language, right? So you can have a distinction between somebody being able to produce sign fluently, but if they have a problem with their articulators, they may not be able to produce speech fluently. And they may also understand everything with, typical accuracy, but fluency we would kind of use as a term to be specific to producing speech. And I think on the same kind of a thing, it's one of those things, it's very clear immediately when you speak with someone if they have difficulty there.
Right.
And, we don't need a benchmark in terms of being able to refine algorithms as humans to know that's the case. And so I think sometimes it's just like now, we used to tolerate our internet speeds being so slow that you'd wait and wait and wait for a page to load. And now a page doesn't load and we're immediately put off by it, right? So I think the models are very fast, right? ChatGPT, I don't know why it acts like it's typing and fills in text rather than, I'm sure that's all coming out instantaneously. Maybe it's trying to seem more like a human communicator than a model. But in interacting with LLMs, I think it seems very fluent, if you want to use that word, or it seems very free flowing, but also competent.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's the wrong vocabulary for this system in the first place.
It's one of these things that people use in specific technical ways, but also as a general thing. Like, I'm fluent in Tagalog or whatever.
Of course. Yeah. So I don't know, Chen-Hao, if you wanted to weigh in on that. Okay. So I did ask this question also of ChatGPT to see how it would respond. So I asked it how it would define fluency, and it said a lot of things. Which is classic ChatGPT. But I think the most interesting ones for me were, so just literally it's the ability to communicate effectively and proficiently. I think we've already kind of touched on that. But I like the second part where it says that fluent individuals are adept at using idiomatic expressions, colloquialisms, and cultural nuances. As we've been having this discussion, I've been thinking about different ways that you can not be fluent. Like if you're speaking a second language, it's clear you don't have the vocabulary, the structure doesn't really exist, but this is sort of something maybe even beyond that. You could be totally fine at speaking, and yet the content isn't really there. Do you think, just in your respective fields, is this something that you would consider looking for if you were ever to devise a baseline for competency in language?
Yeah, I think this is what we would call pragmatic competence, right? If you're going to define, say an autistic child is having difficulty with idioms and nuances and things like that, we wouldn't call it fluency, we would call it pragmatic ability. And it's so important for having functional language. And I think it's, you get a lot of a pass when there's not a human person standing in front of you. Or a avatar or anything, in terms of eye contact and sort of cultural norms or pragmatics for language, it makes a big difference. But just having a text interface peels a lot of that away. And so I think it lets you get away with a lot more.
Yeah, for sure. I guess going on that theme then, are there better or worse ways for teaching language? And this can apply to both humans or like an algorithm that's learning it.
Humans learn best under naturalistic conditions. And if anybody else does Duolingo, that you can do a lot of Duolingo and get in front of a speaker of whatever language you're studying and only ask if they know where La Biblioteca is, or something that you don't really need to use. Right. So there are, lots of data to suggest that immersion and having a reciprocal human to interact with is kind of the only way to learn language to a high definition like this, right? You can learn vocabulary, you can learn syntax, but to have the richness of language that we expect of a competent communication partner, right, there's no way to do it just based on reinforcement and statistical learning, which is what makes LLMs so interesting and that they're able to do this so well.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess maybe it brings into question that there's something else going on. It's not just the context that you would expose a child to, for example, but rather there's like some internal mechanism that is primed. I guess I'm getting towards like universal grammar here. But there's something that makes that actually effective. And maybe we need to put that into AI for the future. I don't know, but
Yeah, that actually gets at there are these interesting developments in the three types of learning that have been happening in AI in the past, especially in the past 5 years or so, that are modeled a little bit on this distinction between first language acquisition and second language acquisition. In first language acquisition, it mostly takes place naturalistically by talking, right? And in second language acquisition, famously, we go into a classroom and the teacher gives us exercises and tells us when we're wrong. And in machine learning, we distinguish these as being unsupervised and supervised learning. And an unsupervised learner just listens to a lot of data and tries to figure out what is the structure of that data. And it's necessary with language to get some kind of structure at some point. And learning that structure takes longer with unsupervised learning, but it's still possible. And it helps you to bootstrap then if you're going to use a supervised learner, where you have a teacher telling you, no, this is the right answer, you should do it this way. The third kind of learning that's actually being used also in the LLMs is reinforcement learning, where the student tries something and then is told whether that attempt is correct or not. And we've been discovering really only in the last 5 years in AI, as we've known in human acquisition for a long time, that you have to have all three. You can't do just one.
Yeah.
Maybe just related to this, I think it's unclear which one is the most efficient way of learning. And I think the winning recipe right now, I think, is where you do this kind of unsupervised learning on very big corpus, where you just try to predict the next word. And then I think there's kind of running belief that that's the main reason that this LLM is very powerful. Then on top of that, you add some little bit of like reinforcement learning from human feedback, or like a little bit of instruction fine tuning. But I think the common belief is that the original LLMs already know language, just doesn't know how to communicate with a human. But on the flip side, I think most people would agree that it's a very efficient way. Like the model has been exposed to way more text than any kind of child or any human can ever be exposed to.
Yeah, no, it's enormous. I remember reading a paper that said they had started to cut back on how much they actually exposed the AI to, and it was still like, millions and millions of sources, and it just seemed so ridiculous compared to what a human actually involved with. I want to kind of shift topics a little bit. We've been talking about the content of language. I'm interested about like the form as well, and whether those two things are separable. And also, can the form of language actually influence how you learn the language itself? So we have a task in our lab, which we ask people while they're in an MRI scanner if they would imagine certain prompts and then report how vivid the prompt actually is. And this is work that Nate Anderson has been doing. So here's a sample prompt. It could be like, imagine a castle on the hill. And then participants are asked to rate how vivid was the sound that you heard, how vivid was the visual that you got. So if we look at how people respond, they tend to have a pretty good spread across the different intensities. So both in visual and in auditory, there are some that are more visual dominated, like imagine someone's face. Then there's some that are more auditory dominated, like the sound of a fire alarm, for example. So this makes a lot of sense. As a fun game, we gave the same prompts to ChatGPT to see how it would respond. And impressively, it did give different responses for different prompts. It wasn't static. And here are the results. So by my eye, that actually looks pretty different from what we see with the humans. And the difference is that it's been shifted super visual. The auditory stuff tends to be much less vivid. And when you think about it, this makes a lot of sense because that's how we're training the models, right? But this also gets to something we've kind of touched upon. Is an AI actually like sensing the information that's behind the language? Or is it actually, it's just, pattern recognition, and we can attribute human things all we want. With this in mind, do you think that there are certain maybe downsides for training a model that only uses visual input versus visual and auditory, or are there certain things about the way that we speak that are, I guess, very auditory dominant?
I think this is saying more of people in writing describing their visual experience much more than their audio experiences, which I think is interesting in many ways. And I think thinking about it, I don't even know, like I have a very limited vocabulary to describe my auditorial experience. And I think that may be part of it's like my exposure to language. And maybe a shared experience by many people.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of an interesting property of like the way that we use language. But going back to the general question, I do think like in order to like, I think what I find most impressive is like the language models are very good at abstract concepts. And I think in a way you can think of like most abstract concepts only exist in text. Right? That's the main way that we get exposure to them as well. There's no way that we can experience abstract concepts through visual or like auditory experiences. And I think that can be both a limitation and also like kind of strength when we think about how to use language models or like what they can be good at. But if we do want these language models to have a visual and auditory experience, maybe those would be like important inputs to these models as well down the road. And again, I think maybe I kind of alluded to that a little bit. I think part of this implicit goal could be that we want to build a machine that behave very similar to a person. But that may not be like the most sensible goal to begin with. Like, why would we want to have a machine that exactly replicates our every ability in the same way? And we clearly have weaknesses and strengths. And for instance, like once we know that we don't usually auditorial, we don't really describe our auditory experiences, maybe it's actually great if we have a model that has much better capability in describing auditory experiences and visual experience, unlike what we are doing in our writing.
Right. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And you know, the goal of what the language is being used for, I think also matters. Like if it's to communicate with a person specifically, then it makes sense to have, I know what a sound sounds like, and I know what seeing things feels like. But maybe that's not the most efficient thing for an AI that doesn't even need those things.
It seems to me like there's a lot of interest in actually doing exactly what you said. People may or may not be useful as trying to build as close to a model of human language as possible as a way to interrogate things that we haven't been able to figure out from studying humans. And there's a big stir in child language in the last week or so as this paper came out in Science that used helmet cam data from a kid to train an LLM based on audio and visual information. And so it got pretty good at distinguishing a referent, like a picture of a noun from 4 other nouns based on the input from, I think, 60 hours of a toddler wearing a helmet cam around. But of course, for people first were like, A, this is amazing, but B, that's not language. That's not what children do. They don't just distinguish from 4 objects, which one is the ball. So I think there's a lot of interest in getting to a model, whether we start with trying to train it like a child or whether we train it in some other way to get it to be like a competent adult. But it seems like there's so much interest in having something that acts like us and acts like our brains, and we don't even understand how our brains act. So I don't know how that's possible, but
I mean, this may be too high level, but I think of the ethical considerations that an AI might have. Like as language speakers, we can communicate really complex ideas, and that is kind of a double-edged sword sometimes. Like I know there was a study that was looking at how AI has like internalized certain biases because it was trained on a set that included those biases. And it doesn't really have the capability of, well, at least at the time, of recognizing, you know, this is bad. This is not something I should be outputting. And maybe that's part of understanding the language, kind of like the definition is understanding the context behind what it's actually saying.
I think one of the things that seems to have held back work too is it seems like ChatGPT doesn't understand what the word grammatical means. And so you say, if you say, is this sentence grammatical? People are saying, oh, it's terrible because it's not good at grammaticality judgments. And from what I understand, it sounds like it doesn't understand what grammatical means.
So fascinating.
And so I think this is the thing of you have to have this deeper understanding. You can't just kind of parse things at the surface and be able to understand what it really can do. And it sounds like when you better explain the problem, it can make very accurate grammaticality judgments. You just can't say, is this sentence grammatical?
Yeah. There's definitely some irony there too, I think, in that it's like one of the biggest tests, but yeah. So I guess, do you have any ideas of what the future might look like for it can be AI, but it can also be just language research and how those two might work together.
Yeah, so I have to bring up this point that Chenhao and I both mentioned that we have now actually just in the past 2 years really excellent working definitions of what intelligence is and of what consciousness is, and a pretty well described in the literature path toward achieving those if we want to achieve them. You know, Turing said that intelligence means that you can fool a human being, and well, ChatGPT does that routinely. On the other hand, there were people who said no, intelligence means the ability to reason, and maybe ChatGPT is not doing that. I got into I first came upon this maybe what's now the standard definition of intelligence in a debate with Greg Technarovich from TTI, the Toyota Technological Institute. I was arguing that a large language model can't be said to be intelligent because all it's doing is predicting what word will come next given all of the previous context.
Right.
And he said, so what you're saying is that it makes reasoned inferences about what's going to happen next, and it can predict those quite accurately based on the past.
Yeah.
How is that any different from what humans do, that humans
Yeah.
call intelligence?
That's a good question, actually, because I think those features are definitely present in people. The question is it using a similar like heuristic or tactic to get there? I don't know.
Yeah. It opens this tremendous can of worms. Like, we think that we have a good idea of how the human brain functions, and we think that a neural network is a generic black box. It's a universal function approximator. It's able to learn the relationship between any input and any output, given enough training examples. And is the brain anything other than a universal function approximator? I don't know if we have a clear statement on that. The other thing that came up actually because of my teaching AI is what is consciousness. You know, the problem with saying that ChatGPT is intelligent is that we all have this idea that intelligence means Frankenstein's monster. It means that we'll create an artificial creation that will be able to write beautiful poetry and will be able to tell its own story in a heart-rending way, right? And one of the things that ChatGPT doesn't have is any awareness of itself as itself.
Yeah.
And so we dig in and we try to find out what consciousness is, and we discover that in fact the only test of consciousness that stands up experimentally is something called the mirror test, where you take an animal that may or may not be conscious and you put a dot of
issues with that test also.
Okay.
Actually. So
You
we can
put a
debate
dot of
that.
paint-
But
Yeah, we can debate it maybe. You put a dot of paint on its forehead and then you show it a mirror, and if it touches its own forehead, then it's conscious in the sense that it's aware of itself as different from the rest of the world in both its own memories and its plans for the future. Right. So we can say that given those two things, we actually have the path forward toward artificial general intelligence if we want to take it. The path is that we create an agent that's able to predict not just the next word, but the next thing that will happen to it in any environment. And that has a clear idea of itself as an entity separate from the rest of the world.
yeah, I remember reading something that there's been so many adaptations to the Turing test since it came out, which is fair because it's very old at this point. But one of them was intelligence is like unpredictability and surprise. So if you can write a program that surprises the coder, then that's like a sign of intelligence. And even I think that was like too vague, so then they changed it, and now it's if you can create something that is, you know, of some merit artistically, then that is a sign of intelligence. But of course, that's super subjective. It's really hard to judge that. So maybe in the end, the simplest test is the one that works. I think we can also go to some of the questions from Slido, as people have been so faithfully putting them in. How can we determine which human behaviors revealed by LLMs are accurate and faithful and which are not? So you mentioned, Mark, this sort of a analog to the mirror test, but like in practice, I guess, how would that look?
I don't personally believe that AI is going to pass that test until we program it to do so, or unless we give it a training criterion that requires it to do so. So if we set it in an environment where its success in a particular task on which we're grading it depends on its ability to distinguish itself from the rest of the world. So that would be the same as programming it to be conscious. If we give it a training criterion that requires it to be conscious in order to pass that criterion.
Interesting. Okay.
I think it's useful to think of AI as a way to generate a hypothesis. And like, I think that's actually like going back to the question you were talking about. Well, I think a very exciting future direction, like another thing that I think AI is exciting about is that you can actually look at the model parameters. You can run it many times. You can kind of see how it reacts to any different prompt. And as a result, that can potentially be a good way to understand how any intelligence understands language or approaches language, that can potentially generate new hypotheses that have been very hard to formulate if we only have access to human brains, which there's no easy way to really access it. But in the end, once whatever hypothesis you generated from this AI model, you need to kind of use, I guess, classic experimental design to run them on human and see whether these theories hold on humans. And I think, like, for instance, in one of the physician fatigues one, I guess, like, you can kind of look at some external measures and kind of see whether it supports valid evaluations. And in the end, I think if your study or the question lends to a good experimental design, I think like the classic experiments are probably still the best way to validate whether theory holds or not.
Yeah.
But I do think the exciting thing is that now there are a lot of new ways one can start to come up with new hypotheses that they couldn't without access to such a machine, I guess.
Right. Yeah, and it's a good question of like, how tied do we need to make these to the human experience? Like, we've talked about that a little bit. I don't know if you've read this book, Impossible Languages. It's by Andrea Moro, I think. But basically, he suggests that language doesn't have to be something that is learnable by humans. You can have a language that's super hard for a human to learn, but that doesn't make it any less of a language. And if you give to an AI, they might not have any problem figuring out, because it's just pattern recognition. But then it gets a little more abstract. You're kind of leaving behind biology, I guess. Do you think that, I guess, looking forward to how we understand language, is it more useful to see it as an abstract concept, or to ground it in how it's expressed within humans, within the particular versions of AI that we have?
Can I answer Moo?
Sorry, what was that?
Unask the question. I mean, why do we need to only do one or the other? I guess.
Yeah, fair.
It's clear that ChatGPT is doing the latter. ChatGPT is reproducing the patterns that it sees in human language, and it's clear that the fact that it does that is the reason that it has all the problems that we've described. That it can't, even though it can easily multiply 4 times 5, it can't multiply 400,000 times 500,000. Right? It has trouble with abstraction.
Yeah.
And so we need to. There have been a lot of studies of abstraction over the course of AI that have somehow not yet integrated with the studies of pattern replication. And that's one of the big areas of research in AI right now, is how do we now integrate those studies of abstraction with the studies of patterns?
For sure.
I think.
Yeah, I was about to say the same thing. I think like a lot of these questions, I think it makes sense to ask some question in binary way, but I think in the end, the answer is likely some combination of both.
Yeah.
And I think that goes to the meta level of the like human and AI of this panel as well. And I think like AI doesn't have to be human, but it's possible. But it's possible to create a world where like both exist and they synergistically work with each other, and AI can potentially help you learn something about a human, but although it doesn't replace or replicate a human exactly.
I was going to say, if you're making one of them more human, you're going to like get rid of our purpose entirely, aren't you? Yeah, so I guess that's interesting, because I know there's at least one question in here, and I had it too, about whether emotion is something that's key for language and understanding the intent. Because you can say things like sarcasm, for example. The meaning is totally different if you understand it's sarcasm versus you don't. So maybe that's something useful for some of the AI here. Thank you so much for coming. I think we can close it off there. And yeah, one more round of applause for our speakers, if we would. All right. Thanks so much for coming.